As I begin, I think it's important for us all to realize that our nation and indeed the world is at a point in transition, a point in history where we're seeing true mega changes begin to take shape. I mean, we're caught in the middle of these changes, and I believe these changes will affect the very nature of how you live, how your children live, and how our future generations live. They're substantive and they're real. Now, change in and of itself isn't good or bad, it's neutral. We've all experienced it in our lives. In fact, I wrote a book called Happiness and Prosperity in the 21st Century, and it's all about change. So the hope that I have today is that I can give you some insights and information that will allow you to take this change and get on the winning side of it. Because the winds are changing, and they're here with us now. So as I begin, I'd like to spend just a moment and talk about myself. It's not that I'm so self-important, but we live in an age today where virtually anybody can get a microphone, and they can get up and say all sorts of things. So as I look at it, it is the experience, the background, and the credibility of the speaker that makes one message resonate with truth, but has another message fall on deaf ears. Briefly, I have a 25-year background in the real world of economics and finance. I started out as a retail broker for the E.F. Hutton and Company back in the 1980s, and I grew up to owning my own private equity company, which I founded after the sale of my last company. Through my experiences, I've had great successes, and I've made millions of dollars on Wall Street. I've also had great losses and lost millions of dollars in investments. It happens. Change happens. But through it, I've had the chance to work with some of the brightest economists in our nation through my time with Wharton Econometrics. And through the privilege I had of starting Chicago Investment Analytics, I worked with the best and brightest money managers from the United States and around the world. In addition, through the sale of that company to a very well-respected Fortune 500 company, the Charles Schwab Company, I've had the chance to work with and learn from some of the savviest business minds out there. So I speak to you today from firsthand experience. I don't come from an ivory tower where things are measured by how they should be, but from your world where things are measured as they are. I don't speak to you as someone who's studied things, but I speak to you as someone who's actually done things. If you want to validate who I am, you can Google me or Google Chicago Investment Analytics, and you'll find that everything I tell you about myself is true. Now, my purpose for being here today is ultimately to share a message of hope and optimism. But I believe that hope and optimism must be tethered to the reality of truth and of fact. Some of the facts that I'll present to you today lead to a change that may be painful for some people. But without knowing the facts, we can't make decisions to run our businesses and our communities as they need to be run. And I'm sure you all have followed this, but history is filled with stories of change. 100 years ago, it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, it was about 20 years after that famous statement came out in the 1900s that 20 years later, the sun sat on the British Empire. It was in the mid-20s when we boastfully said, we'll never have another world war. The great one happened, the war to end all wars. Within 15 years, we were embroiled in another world war. Change happens. Change happens for all of us. Now, you and I could sit here and we could recount all day long the myriad of changes that have happened throughout history. And we could talk about all the times when history repeats itself over and over and over again. The more things change, you and I both know the more they seem to stay the same. So our nation today, and as a result, the entire Western world is in a transitional state. The globalization of economics and finance that we've all seen tied with the recent changes and rapid changes in communications technology and the resulting mega shifts in societal trends is leading us to a conclusion of change, significant change. Now, the first question then that I think needs to be asked is, what is that change? If it can be identified, are there solutions and things we can do to get on the right side of the change? Now, I will tell you, as I thought about today's presentation, and I thought about the message I want to get out, it would be very easy for me to paint a scenario of a doomsday situation and just leave it at that. And then I thought about it, and I thought if I did that, I'd sound either like a politician or a talk show host, so I didn't want to go there. So I'm actually going to try to give you some solutions, too. I want to talk about the setup for this change. And I want you to know that it's not my opinion, but it's fact. You know, I want to look at what's different this time. We have in our life something called a continuity bias. It's a psychological term that we always expect tomorrow to look like today. Well, this time it is different. I talk to people all the time who've lived through either the Depression, and again, those people are fewer and fewer and far between because of their age, but more people who lived through the 70s, like I did. They remember double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, and double-digit unemployment, the misery index. Well, they say to me, you know what? As a nation, we lived through that. What's so different today that makes this worse, maybe? And I want to cover that with you today. And I do wish that the facts that I'm about to give you weren't true, but they are, and you can validate each and every one of them. Let me start with one fundamental law of economics. It's not a hope, it's not a dream, it's a law. And that is that debt must be settled. It's that simple, and yet that profound. All debts must be settled in one of three ways. You either pay them off, you declare a bankruptcy, which means they're forgiven, or in the case of a sovereign nation, you inflate, making the value of the debt precipitously drop. That's it. There's no other way out. So as you leave today, and as you think about your family's future, I hope that you will keep that word in mind. So I want to paint a picture of the debt situation that we face today. And again, you've heard these numbers. I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't fully know. But the ramifications of them are fully real. Number one, the federal government of the United States today is a little over $14 trillion in debt. That's a great deal of money. It equates to about $38,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. And this year, that debt will go up by 10%, so that your $38,000 portion will now be over $41,000. It's a serious number. Now, when you consider that the average family of four in the United States earns $60,000, that federal debt alone is enough to cause them grief. It's very, very serious. But if we want to be honest, do I have any accountants in the room? Some of you may not be comfortable with the term of what's called an unfunded liability, but I'm going to talk about this. Within the federal budget, there are three big items called Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And if we look at these from an accounting basis comparable to the way private business looks at its books, these three programs put another debt on the books of $65 trillion. There's not that much money in the world. Now, if you're not real familiar, let me tell you what that term means. If you go to an insurance company and you buy a $1 million life insurance policy, you pay into that a premium. The difference between their capital account and the amount they've promised you is an unfunded liability. The same is true in a defined benefit pension plan. The difference between the capital account and the amount that's promised is the unfunded liability. If you look at the effect of Social Security and Medicare, over and above that $38,000, it's another $180,000 in potential debt that each of us has. On an average annual income of $60,000, people just can't pay that. And by the way, if you normalize it for taxpayers, it roughly doubles the amount, because about half the people in this country actually pay federal income tax. They're real numbers. If you look at the deficit numbers, I found it interesting. The State of the Union address, they came out and both sides talk about how they're going to cut the budget and do all this wonderful stuff. The next day, the Congressional Budget Office came out and re-estimated this year's deficit from $1.2 trillion to $1.5 trillion. And I personally don't believe that we can look at these political situations and say they're serious about cutting the debts. The president's remarks that night talked about cutting $400 billion over the next 10 years. That's a lot of money for most of us. That's $40 billion a year against a deficit of $1.5 trillion a year. It's not even a drop in the bucket. So I don't want to get political. I really don't. But if any of you are familiar, there was a bipartisan deficit reduction report that recently came out. And it actually proposed solutions to this. It was shot down before the ink got dry. The left said you can't cut benefits. The right said you can't cut tax deductions. It's not going to go away. The further issues that relate to this, and again, I think some of you, especially those in the city governments, understand this, but the federal government's broken into two parts. There's discretionary and non-discretionary spending. The discretionary part is the military, social programs, government operations, and the like. The non-discretionary, mandatory spending are interest payments and the social programs of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We're not even talking about that half. We're looking only at the discretionary budget. So are we serious about dealing with it? I don't think so. And I want to make another point that most people don't think about when they go home to dinner at night. I lived through the 70s where interest rates shot up and were double digits. Think about this with me for a minute. Interest rates are at an all-time low today. If they run up by 1% in terms of cost to the federal treasury to borrow money, 1%, that's an additional $150 billion in deficit. I lived through the 70s. I watched interest rates go to double digits. We get 10% interest rates. You're looking at $1.5 trillion in additional interest costs. They're real numbers. Now, I want to look for a minute, come down to the states, because as we sit here today, 46 of the 50 states are in financial trouble. The poster children are California and Illinois. I mean, we can thank our elected officials for this. If you look at last year alone, the state of Illinois borrowed $4 billion to cover 1 year of the pension liability. You can't tax your way out of that problem. The reality is the higher taxes go, the lower growth rates go, and I think sadly the state of Illinois will see that. So many of these states are in a death spiral. In our state, again, we're sporting a total debt of around $170 billion. That's $13,000 for every one of us. So if you add it up, federal and state, we're now at $230,000. And by the way, just for a point of interest, our debt in Illinois is about 4 times the national average. So if you keep coming down and you look at individuals, us, we hold about $16 trillion in debt. A lot of money. So the bottom line is this. When you look at all these numbers, the bottom line is simply that there's not enough cash to pay these debts. It doesn't exist. You could tax Americans at 100% of their incomes and it doesn't cover it. So I think, as almost negative as all that comes out, if nothing else, you can agree, I paint a foundation of a picture that says change is on the horizon. Something's going to give. Now, there's one additional piece of information I want to give if I haven't already persuaded you that change is on the horizon. And I want to talk about this concept of a reserve currency. People don't think about it. It's not the kind of thing you go home and talk to your kids. Well, I talk to my kids about it at night, but most people don't. The reason Great Britain was the head of the world economically for so long is that the British pound was the world's reserve currency. 2 world wars and a bunch of bad decisions, and they lost that position, and the United States dollar became the preeminent reserve currency around the world. Now, if I want to put that in English, here's what that really means to you and me. What it means is that when countries or businesses trade internationally, they are required to settle their trades in U.S. dollars. So what that does is it causes there to be an artificial demand for dollars. Countries and companies have to hold dollars so they can settle their trades. Well, there's a great deal of talk today globally about eliminating the position of the dollar as a reserve currency. And I'll give you a fact on that. Within the last 2 months, China and Russia came out and actually quit using the dollar. They are now trading directly between Chinese and Russian currencies. So this is a real issue that's going on. What happens if the dollar loses its reserve status? The bottom line impact on you is prices will go up. Imported goods will become more expensive. And what's the most important imported good we have? Oil. Around the world, people pay $5 and $6 a gallon for gasoline. Why don't we? Because we're the reserve. We lose our reserve status, you'll see oil and gas prices go up so that you and I are paying $5 or $6 at the pump. Now translate that through the economy. You run a hardware company. Run it through every product you have in your store. Transportation costs, commodity costs, raw material costs, all of them will rise. And the loss of the reserve status is because of these debts that we have. Again, you hear talk about it, but I'm not sure people in our country really understand the ramifications of these things today. They're real and they're here. So on a purely economic and financial level, the United States, and by virtue of its global leadership, the entire world, is on the brink of a major structural change. Our currency is going to take a hit. Other things are happening too. I mean, you've all undoubtedly read about what's going on in Egypt. In fact, just today, about 2 hours ago, it was announced that Hosni Mubarak will resign today. He's turned over power to the Egyptian military. But you've seen already that transition go through Syria, Tunisia, now into Pakistan. So if you look at the outcomes from these situations, the potential transitions are almost too big to measure. I mean, I don't even want to go here, but global war in the Middle East? That was bad enough in the 60s and 70s. Now there are nuclear weapons involved. We don't even want to go there. There is an almost inevitable outcome of rising fuel prices. Now, I would suggest to you that the chaos in Egypt won't directly cause it. Oil is more rationally priced than that, and it's ultimately priced on supply and demand. But as you get China growing in its demand for oil and the potential supply disruptions in the Middle East, you could greatly see inflation in the oil sector. So we have a fiscal situation that's leading us down the path to a monetary crisis. The question is, what's different about it today? I was just last night watching old videos from the 70s of political guys, and I watched some of the optimism that came out in the inaugural 1980, and I thought, wow, is it really different this time? Let me give you the difference, because it's got to sink home. If you look back to 1979, when Paul Volcker became head of the Fed, we were experiencing, do you remember whip inflation now? We had very high inflation. The Fed, in the last years of the 70s, had expanded its balance sheet by 20%. That led to inflation, it led to a devaluation of the dollar, it led to all these things like we're seeing today. Paul Volcker came in and he said, my number one goal is to support the strength of the dollar. He jacked up Fed interest rates to 20% virtually overnight. Well, what that did is it stabilized the dollar instantly, and it brought inflation down, but at a huge cost. I lived through the recession of 81, 82. I lived in Indiana. We would go to Kokomo, where unemployment was 20%. Well, the solution to that was twofold. The federal government borrowed enormous amounts of money, which was hugely stimulative, and they cut tax rates from 70% to 28%, which was hugely incentivizing productivity. The reason we could do that is that in 1980, we were the world's largest creditor nation. We no longer hold that standing. We are today the world's largest debtor nation. You cannot just go borrow our way out of this. So as I paint a picture and people say, well, this sounds dire, what can be done about it? I want to talk about two solutions. One for you individually. And coming out of finance and investments, it's impossible for me not to think about how you protect your assets. So I want to talk about that because many of you have retirement plans or you've got personal savings accounts. And if we have inflation, those can get greatly affected. Let me consider some things you can do. And I want to talk about themes I think are going to play out. First, as you've already seen, commodity prices are on the rise, and they will continue to. So to the extent you have investable funds, I think you should begin looking at commodity-based investments. There are agricultural ETFs, there's exchange-traded funds you can buy to allow you in and out very easily, in which you can invest in corn and cotton, things like that. I think it's extremely prudent to be buying gold and or silver right now. Not huge. I'm not saying the world's coming to an end. But if you look at the mathematics, if you hold 10% of your assets in gold or silver, if it does change like I think it will, you're protected. It's not a big allocation, but think about it. And I'm asked frequently, should I buy gold or silver? And I will tell you that today, I would probably buy silver, and here's my reasoning. If you look back over a long period of time, gold traditionally trades at 16 times the price of silver. Today, it's like 50 times the price of silver. Now, I don't know if gold's going to come down or silver's going to go up to bring that back to historical norms. But being a quant that I am, I believe in regression to the mean. I think that will compress, and that means silver will outperform gold. So I would buy silver. In addition, I would strongly recommend people buy silver coins. I don't know if you were aware of this, but in the 1937-38 period, we went through a very similar economy to this. And it was during that time the federal government of the United States confiscated people's gold. It became illegal to own gold. They exempted coins. Those are considered collectibles. So it's a little bit of a reason to go out and acquire some gold or silver coins. Now, the second thing I'd recommend, as I talked a little bit, is agricultural commodities. I've got friends who run private equity businesses in the agricultural sector, and they have seen terrific performance in those as prices have come up. I think prices will continue to come up. I think there's no way around it. Corn especially is in almost a perfect storm of getting price appreciation. So I think that's a second idea. The other thing is I would avoid real estate. I got in trouble in 1999. So go back 11, 12 years ago. I gave a speech in Boston, and there were maybe 500 people in the audience. And I said to them rhetorically, what would your house be worth if you had to pay cash? Well, the first thing you hear is that'll never happen. And then when they kind of go to an intellectual understanding, they say, my Lord, it'd be 20%. Well, imagine a world for just a moment where we get interest rates rising like I think they could. Imagine a world when liquidity does dry up. You all watched 2008. That was driven by the real estate market, right? Well, let me tell you what could be the catalyst for the rest of the real estate industry to come down. And by the way, I'm not that radical. Just today they came out, and last month real estate prices nationally were down another 2.3%. So I'm not all wet when I say this stuff. There's some rationale for my believing it to be true. But I want to talk about the two catalyst, I think, for another downdraft in the real estate markets, and that's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. You've all heard of them. They're the quasi-government organizations that guarantee the debt. 6 months ago or so, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac went to the Congress to get authorization to borrow more money, and so Congress effectively said, how much do you need? And the response back was, we don't know. Somebody in here has been to a bank and asked for a loan. If you go in and they say, how much do you need, and you say, I don't know, it usually doesn't go much further. In the case of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, Congress went further. They gave them an unlimited credit line. And it was announced 2 weeks ago that Fannie and Freddie just got authorization to immediately borrow $150 billion from the Treasury. Now here's the problem. The Treasury doesn't have it. So where are they going to go? Fed. The lender of last resort is now the lender of last resort to the Treasury. I want to give you another interesting tidbit. If I were to ask people here who the largest holder of U.S. debt is, most people say China. That's not true. The largest holder of U.S. debt is the United States Federal Reserve. The United States can't sell its debt. The Chinese have been getting out of the dollar since 2009. They've gone now to the Federal Reserve as the lender of last resort. Well, think about it with me for a minute. Where does the Fed get its money? It charges fees to member banks. It charges interest on loans it makes. That's not big enough to cover this. Number three, it expands the money supply. And that's exactly what they're doing. Now, I want to mention kind of one radical idea for you. And this is a low probability scenario, but I want you to take it kind of home with you. I'd recommend you keep some cash on hand. I could very easily draw a scenario out for you in which you go to the ATM one morning and there's no cash for you. About a year ago, 3 a.m., there was a press release announced. Now, if anybody's in marketing in here, you know that you don't do press releases at 3 a.m. They don't get read. Well, this press release wasn't intended to be read. It was from Citibank. As I'm usually up at 3 a.m., I saw it come across the wires and I read it. And it basically said this: Citibank hereby reaffirms its right to withhold withdrawals for a period of 7 days for any reason. Doesn't mean they're going to do it, but they're just stating legally they don't have to give you back your money. Now, if you think I made that up, I have a friend of mine who just recently went to a bank to withdraw $20,000 in cash. The bank said, we don't have it. You have to give us 7 days. There could come a time when the crunch of liquidity that happened in 2008 happens again. We haven't fixed the problem. We band-aided it and pushed it down the road. We did not fix it. So I think if you look at those basic things for your own circumstance, look at some hard commodities like gold and silver, look at some agricultural commodities, look at some cash, try to avoid real estate. Another point, anybody knows this, I think, but sometimes you have to state the obvious. If you own your house and you've got a variable rate mortgage, get out of it. Fix your mortgage at today's rates. They're not going down. Save yourself some grief and fix your mortgage. So there are things personally you can do. But at the government level, and I pray that we can have a discussion about these things from disparate views, we certainly need to roll back discretionary spending. There's no question about that. There's a funny joke that circulated in China recently about Americans having universal health care when the Chinese don't have universal food. The Chinese aren't real anxious to keep loaning us money. So we need to roll back our discretionary spending. And I believe we need to have a talk with you and with all of us about Social Security and Medicare. I think Americans aren't stupid, and I think they understand that if they're painted the picture of what's going on, they'll realize that we have to change the benefit side and the revenue side of Social Security. And let me give you examples. They're not too radical. Right now, you get full benefits in Social Security at 67. If you take that up to 68 or 69 for people 40 and under, you go a long way toward fixing the problem. On the Social Security tax, the FICA tax, I did some numbers and I realized you could actually do a 50% reduction in that tax. Take it from 12% to 6%. Just take the cap off. Right now it's capped at $110,000. Just take it all the way up like we did Medicare. Because you've cut the tax, I think it's a sellable proposition. And I don't know, let me just throw something out on that that's kind of an offense to most people. You know the highest marginal tax rate, the income that generates the highest marginal tax rate in our country? $110,000. The person making $110,000 pays a higher percent of their income in taxes than does the person making $1 million. The reason for that is the FICA tax. So if we more normalize the FICA tax, we might actually do away with that bubble. When it comes to Medicare, the system is broken. I don't know how else to say it. We passed a prescription drug benefit a few years ago that's another $1 trillion add-on that we don't have the money. It's not there. So for Medicare, you maybe have to, we've already taken the tax all the way up, but maybe you take it from its current 2.8 to 2.9%. And I want to thank and I want to give a lot of credit and kudos to the Chamber of Commerce nationally for recognizing these issues and trying to establish a dialogue with the administration to start to cover them, because they have to be talked about. You know, the Chinese, just another point, 2009 they began deleveraging the dollar. They actually got out of it. Do you know that the Chinese government now tells its citizens to buy silver? They see change on the horizon. Now, the other thing I think we need to do and take seriously, and again, here I would credit the Chamber of Commerce with its efforts. There was an interview with Paul Otellini recently, the CEO at Intel, and he was commenting that the cost of American regulation makes it approximately a $1 billion additional cost to build a semiconductor plant in the United States is building it overseas. That's a lot of money, and that's a regulatory system that's broken. We've been in an environment, if anybody's in small business, and again, I know that you've got some small business ideas, the fact of the matter is small business is bearing the brunt of a lot of these regulations, and I credit, again, the National Association of Small Business and the Chamber of Commerce for stepping up to that issue. If anybody's in finance, it's totally gone haywire. And in fact, I was mentioning earlier that in order to do what I do now, to go out and give speeches and give this talk, I had to drop my securities licenses. The fact is, we live in a regulatory environment that is horrid. And one other note on that, little tidbit, I don't know if you knew this or not, but the United States now has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. We just surpassed Japan. I think if you look at it, it's no wonder that corporations are moving overseas to protect the interest of their shareholders. So taxing like this does not lead to growth. It cannot lead to growth. It will not lead to growth. We must consider, as the Chamber of Commerce groups and as other business and community groups, the idea of lowering those tax rates. And I think it's important that we at least sustain and or cut capital gains taxes. We need to give private capital the incentive to fund new entrepreneurial endeavors. So as we all know, our businesses and our governmental organizations thrive when we make decisions based on facts, not based on hopes and dreams. So today, I've spoken about facts. They're irrefutable and they're truth. Some of the facts aren't pretty, but they are fact. We head toward a change and a transition that is not necessarily bad, but change in transition it is. And I think you can prosper from it. Volatility makes money. But in order to do so, you have to be strongly in the intellectual and emotional position to make the hard decisions today that put you on a path to prosperity tomorrow. Thank you very much for your time and attention.